I will say, being here over on the Western Slope, has brought back a lot of memories. I visited a lot, but not usually at 2 week stretches. And going through some of the old stuff in the house has made me realize that that a lot of life has been lived in this house that I'm in. A lot of slumber parties with friends happened in this room that I'm talking in right now. I think that if in the summertime when it gets warm, you can still smell the feet smell from some of my friends. Some of my friends had some really stinky feet, and it stunk up this room, and I think it's, you can still smell it sometimes. I'm assuming you're laughing at that because it's funny. I remember one time we had a sleepover, and there was it was after school had gotten out, and it was an exceptionally difficult school year, and we decided that we were going to hang out in the backyard with, it was me, my brother Matt, and my friend Nathan, who had decided to, Nathan lived down the street, just down the street from here. And so we decided to celebrate the end of school. They were retiring a set of textbooks that they had given, that we had used, and they let us keep them. And so the way we decided to celebrate this particular school year ending was by burning that textbook. And so we doused it in cheap cologne and went back, where you couldn't see in the backyard from any of the bedroom windows in the house, and we lit it on fire. And after we kind of had this ceremonial school is over excitement moment, we put it out and decided to hide the evidence behind the shed. I don't know if you know this, but a really great place to store a smoldering ember is inside of a outdated algebra book. And as we threw that book behind the shed, it smoldered and sat there and kind of grew. And around 1 o'clock in the morning, the three of us and the rest of the house, for that matter, are awoken by someone pounding on the front door saying it was the fire department. And so the fire department was here to let us know that our celebration had spread to the neighbor's fence and the shed. And so we put it out. We got it all taken care of. And that summer, we were supposed to go visit my dad in California. And, I was afraid that we were going to have to miss that trip. And so what we ended up doing was my brother and I ended up pulling all of the stuff out of the shed and repairing that. And I was really struggling because my friend Nathan didn't end up helping with all of the rebuilding of the fence, even though it was his idea to burn the textbook. And I just sat there as we were pulling stuff out of the shed and pulling boards off of the fence, and sat there thinking about how unfair it was that Nathan wasn't there to help. The more we worked, the more soot and ash we were covered with, the more stuff we pulled out, the more mad I was about this whole situation. And I remember the conversation was about that was ultimately that we were for sure responsible for our part, and we had to take care of that. And it was a lot of hard work. I don't know if you've ever had to sift through the stuff that's a result of a fire, but it has a very distinct, it's more than just campfire. It could have been a lot worse. The lawnmower and the lawnmower gas was in the shed, and that didn't catch, and so that was ended up being a lot better than it could have been. I just remember that moment being less about this fire that we had caused, this problem that we had caused, and for me, it became more about how unfair it was. And I don't know if you know this, I'm the oldest, and as the oldest, the world being fair is a really important thing to me. And so, the fact that Nathan didn't have to help us with this project was really, really disappointing to me. It bothered me, and I think the reality is that we live in a world that fair is important, right? Things being fair is important, and we get fixated on how that kind of thing works. And sometimes, because we're so fixated on what things are fair and whether things are fair, we forget about the work that we have to do. Sorry, I just smacked the microphone. Hopefully it's not too loud. We forget about the work that is ours to do. Because I don't know if you know this, I don't control other people. You don't control other people. That's good news, bad news, because sometimes people do stuff that we wish that they wouldn't. Bad news, though, is that sometimes people do things that we wish that they wouldn't, and we wish that we could stop them from doing it. So we're looking at a passage this morning, and unfortunately, because of the way the whole setup here has worked, we don't have slides. So if you have a Bible with you, we're going to be looking in Colossians chapter 3. Melody last week talked about this whole passage, and I really love the fact that she brought out this issue having to do with forgiveness. This passage comes right after that. And let me give us a little context. That's my thing. Context for this is that in ancient times, which, the New Testament is written in what would be considered ancient times, there were often writings that happened in these kind of contexts that they would list out, the household codes. These things, these ways of living and these are the rules for the way the house works. And, a lot of these things were, pretty detailed sometimes. In some of Paul's other writings, he goes into a lot more detail. But in this particular passage here, it's interesting because it feels a little bit like an abrupt change. He's talking in the previous passages about clothing yourselves with compassion and kindness and humility and meekness and patience and bearing with one another and forgive each other. And then he goes into this section where he talks about these household codes, this way that the house, and in this particular situation, the way he's talking about this is as if the family of God is a house for which he's establishing household rules. There is a Greek word that is used to talk about the culture of the household, and it's the Greek word oikos. Yes, I know that is a Greek yogurt brand, but that's not what I'm talking about. Oikos is this idea of this culture that has to do with the way things work within a community. You would describe that culture as oikos. And so what Paul is doing here is he's establishing an oikos for this community in Colossae. And it's interesting because when we read passages like this one here today, like they result in us having feelings. I remember a couple of weeks, it's been a couple months ago now, we were talking, when we talked about, in youth group, we were talking through the book of Ephesians, and there's a very similar section in the book of Ephesians. And when we got into this, I remember all of the girls in the room, when we got to this idea about submission, like the hair went up on the back of their necks. And like they were ready to fight me, which was dangerous to me because half of them were going home to my house. And so let's look at this. Let's break it down, because I think these are passages that are really interesting, because what happens to us is that we make a lot of assumptions when we arrive at these passages. We assume we know what Paul is all about. Most of us have been told and have had communicated to us that Paul is a misogynist. You know, he is not about women. He doesn't support women. He's not supportive of the roles. And I'm not saying that he's not. I'm saying that in the context that he's in, I think that if we pay attention, one of the things that I talk about a lot is this idea that we have to slow down when we read Scripture. We have to slow down when we read Scripture and pay attention to what's happening. And if we do that, we're going to notice some really interesting things about this passage. Okay? So, before I read it, I'd like to point out a couple of things, okay? First of all, there are three different pairings of people groups in the passage. Wives and husbands, children and fathers, slaves and masters, okay? And I want you to notice something as you scan through this passage. Do you notice which group is mentioned first each time? It's actually really interesting because emphasis and priority is a big deal within the Greek language. In the Greek language, you don't have punctuation, you don't have commas. It's not there's like the subject and the predicate and the all of those different pieces. In English, those things, the order of those things drastically change the meaning of the sentence. In Greek, you order the sentence not by the subject and the predicate of the sentence. You order the sentence based on priority. And the thing that would have stuck out in the minds of the people who read this was, why did Paul mention wives first? Why? Why did Paul mention children first? Why did Paul mention slaves first? It's a really interesting question, because that's not necessarily how it would have been done. Like, you would address the person of importance first. So what is Paul doing here? Second of all, in each of these groups of people, what I want us to pay attention to is that in Paul's mind and in the reader's mind, the group of people that he's talking to has, wives and children and slaves. The group of people that he's specifically talking to would be somebody of status. The husband is also the father and is also the master. The man in this particular situation is the character that you read about in ancient literature, and we've talked about it before. He is the pater familia, the godfather, the man of influence, the man of power. So the fact that Paul is talking about and to this pater familia and mentioning him second, it's even more important. The order is even more important. See, Paul is intentionally poking. You see, Paul is intentionally pricking the ego of the person that he's talking to. And that's really interesting to me. You know, it's easy for us in modern 21st century Western American context to look at this passage and think, well, Paul is telling wives that they have to act a specific way. And what I would love to point out to you is that in every one of these scenarios that is being the intention here, you have the wives and the children and the slaves. Every one of these, let's talk about the wives for a second. In ancient culture, particularly Greek and Roman culture, wives' responsibility was to their husbands. Their responsibility was to the household. Their responsibility was to submit. That was the context. Paul didn't create that context. That was the context that he was operating in. Children were supposed to obey their parents. That was the context. No question. No challenge. You're expected to obey. Slaves were expected to obey. So slaves were expected to submit. So in every one of these things, in every one of these categories, Paul doesn't change the cultural expectation. And let me explain that for a second. I don't know if you're familiar with the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire was huge. It was massive. It was powerful. It held the power over life and death. They could kill you, and they would kill you if you defied. And they held very strongly, they held their laws and their rules and their way of life very high in their context. And I want you to remember that Paul is writing this letter early on in the church's history. He's not writing this after Constantine, after the church has been given power and given authority and given rule. He's writing this in the early days. Like in the early days, the church is operating on the precipice. They could go one way or the other. There is no, like, any kind of cultural resistance at this point it's not going to be heard. It's not going to be acknowledged. It's not going to make a difference. And that's one of the things I want us to pay attention to. And so what I will say, an interesting thing that Paul says to wives, to children, and to slaves is that he creates a context for them to be able to flourish in that environment. Children, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. And this in the Lord thing is a thing that's really important for us to pay attention. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is the acceptable duty in the Lord. And slaves, he actually spends the longest time in this passage talking to slaves, which I find incredibly interesting because no one wrote letters to slaves. No one acknowledged what the working conditions, what the way of life, what was going on for these people. He talks to them like they're people. He says, in verse 22, he says, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, not with a slavery performed merely for looks, to please people, but wholeheartedly fearing the Lord. Whatever task you must do, work as if your soul depends on it, as for the Lord and not for humans, since you know that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You serve the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for whatever wrong has been done, and there is no partiality. The wrongdoer will be paid back. So what Paul does in each of these situations is he creates a context for that group of people to operate in a way that keeps them safe. Wives, submit to your husbands. There's no guarantee that the husband in this scenario is also a part of the church or a believer or on the same page. Fathers or children, obey your parents. Do this, and it's the way that you navigate. Slaves, don't serve your master. Serve God. Serve the Lord. All of this is a matter of perspective taking. I don't know if you've noticed, but the perspective that you take in a difficult situation can make or break the situation. The perspective that you take in that scenario can change everything. What's particularly interesting to me is the way that he addresses this paterfamilia. To husbands, he says, love your wives and never treat them harshly. The word love here, the only other time this Greek word is used to describe the love that God has. It's the agapeo love. It's the unconditional, self-sacrificing, self-giving love, self-emptying love. That's what he says to husbands. And guess what? That is not a cultural expectation. That is the antithesis of the cultural expectation for husbands. When Paul says this, everyone in the room's ears perk up. Second, the way he talks to children. He says to children, or to fathers, keep in mind, this is the same person. Imagine this is this father is also the husband and is also the master. It's almost like he's getting lectured. He says, fathers, do not provoke your children, or they may lose heart. Fathers, I want you to parent like how your parenting matters. I want you to parent your children in a way that takes into consideration how your parenting affects your children. Don't speak harshly. Don't yell. Don't talk down to them. Create a safe environment for them. That is also not a cultural expectation of their time. And the very last section here, it's actually in chapter 4. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, for you know that you also have a master in heaven. Like, when I looked closer at this particular passage, it blew my mind. Because one of the critiques that we have constantly about Paul is he doesn't speak out against slavery. And that's correct. he doesn't overtly speak out against slavery. But when we look closer at this particular passage, it is very interesting. The second part is where I'd like to start. And he says this. He says, "For you know that you also have a master in heaven." Yes, we all do. You know, one of the things that we say is, Jesus is Lord. That Greek word that's translated as Lord is Kyrios. And it means supreme. It means the ruler. In their context, when you say Jesus is Lord, you're saying that Caesar is not. It's a commitment to loyalty to the way of Jesus. When we say Jesus is Lord, it's a commitment to the way of Jesus as opposed to Caesar, to empire. And so when Paul says here, "For you know that you also have a master in heaven," what he's intentionally doing is focusing their attention on the way that the master in heaven treats them. And let's think about that for a second. The master in heaven, the Father or the Lord, how does the master treat you and I? What does the master work for you and I? I think that the master pretty regularly works toward freedom for us. Paul intentionally speaks to this paterfamilia, this man who is a Lord, and it says, "Hey, your responsibility to your wife, to your children, to those who you rule over, is to create a safe context." But it's more than that, because the first part of that verse says, "Masters, treat your slaves justly." The word that's translated as justly is the same root word as Paul uses in other places to talk about being justified before Christ. Think about that for a second. Paul talks about this idea of being justified, of having appropriate or a right standing before God. And then fairly. The literal definition of the word that's being translated as fairly here is with equality. Think about that for a second with me. Paul says, "Masters, treat your slaves as if they have right standing and with equality, as if they are equals." This section is so profoundly countercultural. And I didn't want to talk about this today because I want to maybe change your perspective on Paul. That's not especially important to me. What is important to me is to know that today, in 2024, there are those who have power and those who don't have power. And there is a way that Paul would speak to us who have power. And the way that Paul would speak to us who have power is to operate with self-sacrificial, self-giving, self-deferential love. To create a context where those who are under us when we have power have a safe place to live and operate and be in. For us to treat people with equality and justice. I think this passage is particularly important. I just would invite us to think for a second about what our world, what Longmont, what Reveille, what our context could look like if we would recognize the cultural influence that we have. The cultural influence that we have. And when we recognize that, we would learn, as Paul encourages this paterfamilia, this father, this ruler, this Lord. He encourages this person to operate in a very particular way, in a way that doesn't cling to power, a way that doesn't cling to coercion, that doesn't cling to manipulation, that doesn't cling to un-Christ-like ways of operating in the world. What would it look like if we, as followers of Jesus, would pay attention to that? It's really easy for us to look at this and see how other people should be behaving. And to feel like, well, that's not fair. You know, more often than not, passages like this I've heard preached in a way that have been used to tell women, you need to submit. Children, you need to obey. Servants, you need to do the thing that you're supposed to do. But that's not the emphasis here. That's not the most important drive that Paul has here. Paul's most important drive here is how he is talking to people who have power. So I would invite us today to rethink to reevaluate the way that we use and the way that we operate and the way that we live among one another. I'd like to invite Tony back up.